A moment ago, they had no idea who I was. Their eyes flickered over me, from my polished leather shoes to the skin they believed did not belong. A subtle smirk, a coldly polite gesture, like a rehearsed act in a well-practiced play, and then the words came. I'm sorry, but you need to leave. I didn't argue. I didn't justify myself. Why should I? The real show had yet to begin. Soon, they would understand that the hotel they were so eager to protect from my presence would soon belong to me. Standing before the Windsor Grand, its towering elegance gleaming under the city lights, I couldn't help but marvel at the absurdity of it all. My tailored suit sat perfectly on my frame, my shoes shone like mirrors, and tucked safely in my pocket was the key to a world I had already conquered: wealth, success, recognition. And yet, here I was, standing at an invisible barrier not made of stone or glass, but of something much stronger: prejudice. Their eyes were on me, measuring, evaluating, dismissing. To them, I was just a black man who had stepped through the wrong door. In their perfectly curated world of luxury and exclusivity, I was an outlier, a flaw in their otherwise pristine picture. This place, meant to symbolize prestige, comfort, and hospitality, was instead steeped in an unspoken hostility. The tension in the air was palpable, like the charged silence before a storm. The staff had already begun whispering among themselves, exchanging knowing glances. To them, I wasn't a potential guest, I was a problem. But I wasn't angry. What fascinated me more than their rejection was their certainty. The speed with which they judged, the ease with which they dismissed, it was second nature to them. I had seen it before. The money I had earned could open any door, but money could never buy what had already been poisoned by human bias. My worth did not need their validation. My story was just beginning. As I stepped onto the gleaming marble floors of the lobby, I felt the weight of their stares, the grandeur of the space. The golden chandeliers, the elegant furniture, the pristine architecture was meant to inspire awe. But all I felt was the icy chill of condescension. Here, luxury did not exist without arrogance. I moved toward the reception desk, where a man stood, Edward Langley, the hotel manager. He was tall, blonde, and wore the kind of smile that had been rehearsed 1,000 times. He barely glanced up, yet somehow he already knew what he was going to say. And then, when his gaze finally met mine, I saw it. The calculation, the quiet dismissal. His eyes flickered over my tailored suit, acknowledging my wealth yet refusing to let it matter. I'm sorry, but we have no available rooms, he said, his tone polite but firm. I wasn't surprised. It wasn't the rejection itself that struck me. It was the certainty with which he delivered it, as if he wasn't even making the decision himself, as if something much larger, a system built on silent discrimination, was speaking through him. In this world, luxury and arrogance went hand in hand. His words felt like the closing act of a play that, for me, had only just begun. I could have spoken my name. I could have shattered their illusion in an instant. If I had, the entire atmosphere would have shifted. They would have tripped over themselves apologizing, offered me their finest suite, showered me with insincere pleasantries. But that would have been too easy. I wanted to see how far they were willing to go. A shadow moved at the corner of my vision. A large man, bald-headed and broad-shouldered, approached with calculated steps. Frank Dawson, the security guard. His face was unreadable, but his posture was clear. He was here to remove me. Sir, I'll have to ask you to leave, he said, his voice polite but carrying the weight of finality. There was nothing to discuss. I met his gaze and held it. I had no desire to argue, no need to plead my case. Their arrogance, their ignorance. It was a lesson I would remember, but not one that deserved an explanation. Without a word, I turned and walked toward the exit. My footsteps echoed against the marble floors, each one a quiet promise of what was to come. They had no idea how close they were to their world, turning upside down. As I reached the doors, I paused for a moment and glanced back. Very soon this hotel would be mine. And when that day came, they would understand just how easily illusions can shatter. A few weeks had passed since the day I walked out of the Windsor Grand, leaving behind the smirks, the dismissive glances, and the arrogance of those who thought they knew who I was. Back then, I chose silence over confrontation, not because I was weak, but because I had a greater plan in mind. Conflict would have been pointless. Power, on the other hand, was the real game. During that time, my course of action became clear. This wasn't just about reclaiming my dignity. It was about something much bigger. It was about rewriting the narrative they had so blindly accepted. The irony was almost poetic. For so long, they had judged people by their appearance, never imagining that the man they had dismissed so effortlessly would soon hold their futures in his hands. Now, I stood before the same towering building, the same grand entrance, the same polished floors. But everything had changed. I was no longer just a guest, an outsider they could turn away with a few indifferent words. I was the owner. As I walked into my lawyer's office to finalize the purchase, I felt a familiar rush, not of anger, but of something far more powerful, anticipation. The moment was symbolic. This was where insults turned into leverage, where humiliation transformed into absolute control. I wasn't here to settle petty scores. I had no interest in childish retaliation or hollow revenge. My plan was far more elegant. I would let them dismantle their own illusions. Their pride, their self-importance, those things would be their downfall. They would destroy themselves. When the final documents were placed before me, I smirked as I picked up the pen. With a single signature, the hotel was mine. Returning to the Windsor Grand, I stepped through the doors not as a guest, but as its master. The chandeliers still sparkled, the scent of expensive cologne and fresh flowers filled the air, and the staff bustled around, unaware that the ground beneath them was about to shift. To them, I was still invisible. My name had not yet been announced in the boardroom. No one had whispered about new ownership in the halls. And that gave me the greatest advantage. I could observe them in their natural habitat, unchanged and unfiltered. The first meeting with the hotel's general manager went exactly as I expected. Gerald Whitmore was a middle-aged man with the same polished arrogance I had seen in Langley. His handshake was firm, his confidence unwavering, because in his mind, nothing was out of place. Our staff is stable and highly professional, he said with a hint of pride. We haven't had to let anyone go in a long time, and our turnover rate is minimal. I nodded, keeping my expression unreadable. Inside, I was more certain than ever. His world was crumbling, and he had no idea. I watched them closely. The same Edward Langley, the manager who had denied me a room, still carried himself with the same air of superiority. Frank Dawson, the security guard who had escorted me out, still prowled the lobby as if he held real authority. They all continued their routines, oblivious to the fact that every move they made was now being watched by the man they had once dismissed. As I descended the marble staircase after the meeting, I paused, considering my next move. Should I act now? Should I tear their world apart in an instant, expose them for what they were, and fire them all on the spot? No, that would be too easy. Patience. The downfall of the arrogant should never be rushed. The best kind of reckoning is one that unfolds slowly, allowing them to cling to their delusions just long enough to feel the panic settle in. And then unexpectedly, the moment arrived. I was walking through the corridor, casually observing the space that now belonged to me, when I saw him, Langley. He was at his desk, flipping through a logbook, entirely engrossed in his work. He didn't see me. He didn't even notice I was standing just a few feet away. This time, I wasn't invisible. This time, I was the owner of the building. I held his career in my hands. For a brief moment, I considered how easy it would be. One word, and his entire world would collapse. One word, and his position, his status, his security would be stripped away. But where was the satisfaction in that? No, the real satisfaction was in the slow realization, the dawning horror as the truth unfolded before them piece by piece. I wanted him to see the cracks forming beneath his feet. I wanted him to dig his own grave without even realizing it. Smiling to myself, I turned and walked away. There were more important steps ahead. That morning, as I prepared to face them, I could feel the air itself had changed. Maybe it was just my own anticipation, but something about the atmosphere in the hotel seemed different, heavier. It was almost as if, on some subconscious level, they could sense that their comfortable little world was no longer as secure as they had once believed. But they didn't know, not yet. They would soon. I was calm, cold even, but inside, my resolve burned. As I stood before the doors to the conference room, I took a deep breath. I allowed myself a small smile. They weren't expecting this. There had been no announcement, no warning, no chance for them to prepare. That was the entire point. I wanted to see the moment realization dawned on their faces. I stepped inside. The room was already filled with staff, seated around the polished table, discussing the day's agenda. Langley stood near the board, addressing the group with the same arrogance he had worn the day he turned me away. For a moment, I simply watched. He spoke with confidence, completely unaware that his world had already collapsed. And then, finally, our eyes met. I saw it, the flicker of recognition, the instant where confidence turned to uncertainty, where the mask slipped for just a second. He tried to hide it. He forced his face into neutrality, but it was too late. "Who are you?" he asked, though I knew he already feared the answer. I took a step forward, my voice calm but sharp enough to cut through the silence. "I'm your new owner." The room fell into absolute stillness. The weight of my words settled over them, heavy and undeniable. Every pair of eyes turned toward me, and just like that, their illusion shattered. I took a deep breath, allowing myself a small, knowing smile. There had been no warnings, no memos, no time for them to prepare. That was intentional. I wanted them to feel the shift, to experience the unease of walking on a floor that had suddenly lost its stability beneath them. As I entered the conference room, the scene was almost amusing in its normalcy. The staff sat in their usual places, focused on the day's agenda. No one paid me any attention at first. I was still invisible to them. I chose a seat in the corner, deliberately remaining unnoticed. I wanted to observe them in their natural state, to watch them carry on with the same blind arrogance they had worn when I had stood in this very building as an outsider. At the front of the room, Edward Langley, the same manager who had so casually denied me a room, stood confidently by the board. His voice carried the same self-assurance, the same quiet authority he had used when he had dismissed me. He laid out the day's objectives with practiced ease, unaware that his reality had already changed. Then it happened. Our eyes met. For a single moment, I saw the flicker of recognition in his gaze. His words faltered, caught mid-sentence. The confident rhythm of his speech collapsed in an instant. His face went pale, his breath caught in his throat, but then, like any man accustomed to control, he forced his expression into something neutral. A mask of professionalism slipped into place, though I could see the panic swimming just beneath the surface. "Who are you?" he asked, his voice even but sharp, as though trying to reassert dominance in a situation that was already lost to him. But we both knew the answer. The room fell into absolute silence. Every pair of eyes turned toward us, the air suddenly thick with an unspoken tension. "I'm your new owner." I said it simply, without raising my voice. Yet the weight of my words crashed through the room like a tidal wave. Langley's face shifted through an array of emotions: disbelief, confusion, and then, unmistakably, fear. He looked around as if searching for an escape, a lifeline, some alternative reality where this wasn't happening. But there was none. This moment, this realization, was the true beginning of his downfall. Everything he had once considered his strength, his position, his authority, his influence, had suddenly turned against him. He was no longer the gatekeeper. He was just another employee. And worst of all, he now answered to the man he had once dismissed. I stood up and walked toward the door. No one moved. No one spoke. They sat frozen in stunned silence, trying to process the shift that had just taken place. But this was only the beginning. They expected chaos. They expected immediate firings, sweeping restructures, and desperate attempts to reclaim control. But that wasn't my plan. I wasn't here to burn the hotel to the ground. I was here to unravel it from within. I had always been fascinated by what lies beneath a person's mask, how they behave when the floor beneath them cracks, when the illusions they've built around themselves begin to collapse. And so, rather than tearing their world apart in one swift motion, I chose patience. With each passing day, I observed them. I watched as they navigated the fragile balance of their new reality, unaware that they were being studied. I could have destroyed their confidence in an instant, but I wanted them to do it themselves. I wanted to watch them struggle, to see them realize the weight of their own prejudices, not because I forced it upon them, but because they could no longer ignore it. Then the real test began. I didn't fire anyone, not yet. Instead, I made one small but significant change: the work schedule. The same managers and staff who had once distanced themselves from the lower-level employees who had carried themselves with quiet arrogance, were now required to work alongside them. There were no more unspoken hierarchies. They were equals now. Langley, who had once strutted through the lobby like he owned it, was now required to shadow the front desk employees. The security team, including Frank Dawson, had to work shifts in guest relations, assisting guests with their complaints and needs. Even Gerald Whitmore, the general manager, was assigned to routine tasks he had once deemed beneath him. It was a subtle shift, but the effect was immediate. I watched as their arrogance began to erode. At first, they resisted, treating the changes as temporary inconveniences. But as days turned into weeks, their discomfort became undeniable. They were now in the same positions as the people they had once overlooked. They had to experience firsthand the world from the perspective they had so easily dismissed. And I watched it break them. Langley, who had once commanded respect through sheer confidence, now fumbled with guest reservations, his frustration barely hidden behind a forced smile. Dawson, the security guard who had forcibly removed me, now had to politely escort VIP guests to their suites. It was a slow, methodical unraveling. Each day their unease grew, their pride cracked, their masks slipped, and I was there to watch it all unfold. This wasn't revenge, this was justice. The shift was happening, slowly but inevitably. I watched as Edward Langley, once so sure of his place in this hotel, began to unravel. The confidence that had once defined him was slipping away, day by day, replaced by something much more fragile: uncertainty. The changes I had put in place forced him into situations he had never imagined himself in. No longer did he stand above the others, giving orders from a place of comfort. Now he was forced to negotiate with junior staff, oversee mundane operations, and handle menial tasks he had once deemed beneath him. Each day the tension in his face grew. The air of authority he once carried had turned into something else: desperation. But it wasn't just him. The other employees, once so sure of their untouchable status, had begun to falter under the weight of the new reality. Their false sense of importance melted like ice under the sun. I could see it in their body language: the shorter conversations, the lack of forced smiles, the way they avoided eye contact as they moved through the halls. No one knew what was coming next. That was where my satisfaction lay. I had become more than just the owner of the hotel. I was the invisible hand guiding their downfall. One day, during a routine walk through the hotel, I encountered Langley in the lobby. He looked exhausted. His usual composure had fractured. But still, he tried to cling to what little he had left. "We need to talk," he said, his voice trembling just slightly despite his efforts to appear in control. I stopped in front of him, waiting. "It's about my role in the hotel," he continued, "about the importance of what I do." I almost laughed. This was the moment I had been waiting for. I let him speak, saying nothing, watching as he tried to justify his existence. His words were not those of a man defending his contributions. They were the desperate pleas of someone trying to convince himself that he still mattered. But I knew the truth. He was already irrelevant. His voice carried the same authority as before, but the weight behind it was gone. His carefully crafted arguments sounded hollow, as if even he didn't believe them anymore. And I let him talk. I let him grasp for the remnants of his power. When he finally finished, I smiled. Not mockingly, not cruelly. It was a calm, measured smile, the kind that a man gives when he holds all the power in the room. "I remember you," I said, locking eyes with him. The color drained from his face. "I remember how you kicked me out of here." He knew. He had known from the moment he saw me in that conference room, but he had never dared to say it aloud. And now he couldn't ignore it. The weight of the past came crashing down on him in an instant. His lips parted, as if to say something, but no words came. Silence stretched between us. There was nothing left for him to argue, nothing left to fight for. The illusion he had built around himself had shattered. He had spent years believing he was above others. Now, he understood that he was just another employee, replaceable, powerless, and I was the one deciding his fate. This was only the beginning. Every day in this hotel had become a chess game, each move carefully calculated. They still saw me as just the owner, someone who stayed in the shadows, detached from the daily workings of the hotel. But that wasn't true. I was watching everything. I started making small changes. Nothing drastic, nothing obvious. A slight adjustment to the work schedule, a redistribution of responsibilities, a new structure to daily operations. To an outsider, these changes seemed ordinary, insignificant. But I knew better. I was weaving a web, carefully, methodically. I wanted to see how far they would go to hold on to their positions, and the results were predictable. People who had lived in comfort for too long will do anything to keep it. At first, the resistance was small. Mild irritation, subtle complaints. Why should this affect me? They muttered to one another. But as the days passed, the cracks began to show. Mistakes were being made. Some tried to cover them up, others hid their shortcomings, and some resorted to the oldest trick in the book, betrayal. I watched from my office as the atmosphere in the hotel changed. For years, these people had built their careers on deception and false confidence. But now the rules were different. Their old strategies no longer worked. One employee, desperate to hide his incompetence, lied about completing a task. Another, fearing exposure, actively sabotaged a colleague. And then one day, I overheard something that truly amused me. Two employees were whispering in a hallway, thinking no one could hear them. "I can't get this done on time," one of them said, his voice low and desperate. "But if you help me, I'll tell management it was all your achievement." The other scoffed, shaking his head. "You want me to do your work? No way. I'll just tell them you screwed everything up." I smiled to myself. It was happening. The same people who had once looked down on others were now turning on each other. The house of cards they had built was collapsing, and all I had to do was watch. It was happening. I had watched them for weeks, seen the cracks in their carefully constructed personas widen. The moment had arrived when survival instincts overtook loyalty, and they were finally willing to sacrifice each other just to hold on to their slipping power. That overheard conversation between two employees, one begging for help, the other refusing and threatening to expose him, told me everything I needed to know. They were turning on each other. It was time. That evening, I summoned the entire staff to the hotel's grand conference room. No explanation was given. Yet, as they filed in, I could see it in their faces. They knew something was coming. Some exchanged nervous glances, others tried to mask their unease with forced indifference. But the tension in the air was suffocating. I let the silence hang heavy in the room as I stood before them. Then, in a voice calm but sharp enough to cut through their pretense, I spoke. "Today, I want to talk about how your deceit is not just destroying this hotel, but also yourselves." Eyes darted around the room. "For weeks, I have been watching you, and do you know what I've seen? Lies. You lie to each other, you lie to yourselves, and you have lied to me. Each of you has built your careers on deceit, manipulation, and exclusion." I let the words settle, let them sink deep into their consciousness. Some lowered their gazes, others stiffened in their seats, but no one spoke. "And today," I continued, "I will show you where that has led you." At that moment, I turned to the large screen behind me. With the press of a button, the evidence played out before them. Security footage, emails, documents, every lie, every scheme, every desperate attempt to cover their tracks exposed. Gasps filled the room as the reality of their situation crashed down on them like a tidal wave. I watched their faces, shock, horror, despair. Some went pale, others clenched their jaws as if bracing for impact. There was nowhere left to hide. "You thought you could hide behind your deception?" I said, turning back to face them. "But that's no longer possible." I saw it, the exact moment they realized the game was over. This wasn't just an exposure, it was a reckoning. The realization that everything they had built, their false sense of power, their superiority, their carefully curated world, had crumbled right before them. But I wasn't done. I knew that for some, mere exposure wasn't enough. Their prejudice wasn't just a flaw, it was their foundation. To truly break them, they needed to confront the consequences of their actions. So, I did not fire them, not yet. Instead, I redesigned the hotel itself. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, I removed their privileges. At the same time, I brought in new staff, individuals who had been overlooked, rejected, pushed aside. Most of them were Black. They were talented, hardworking, and ready to prove themselves in an environment that had once shut its doors on them. And now, they were in charge. The power dynamic had shifted. Those who once ruled this hotel with arrogance now had to answer to the very people they had dismissed. I watched as the old staff struggled. At first they resisted. They whispered among themselves, clinging to the idea that this was temporary, that the old hierarchy would return. But it never did. Bit by bit, they lost their grip on the world they once controlled. And then, one day, Langley finally faced his moment of reckoning. I entered the hotel lobby and spotted him behind the reception desk. The same man who had once denied me a room without a second thought was now reduced to performing the very tasks he had once considered beneath him. His hands trembled slightly as he shuffled papers, pretending to be occupied, pretending that he still had authority. He was a man who had once ruled with arrogance. Now, he was just another employee. And then the final blow came. A family approached the desk. A mother, a father, 2 young children. They were black. Langley saw them, and his face turned ghostly pale. Recognition flickered in his eyes, followed by something deeper, fear. Because now he had to serve the very people he once rejected. His voice was weak when he finally spoke. "Good afternoon," he stammered. The father nodded politely. "We've booked a room for a week. We'd like to check in." Langley's Adam's apple bobbed as he swallowed. There was no escape. His hands hovered over the keyboard as he hesitated before typing. His fingers moved slowly, unsteadily. His entire sense of identity was unraveling in real time. This was the moment I had been waiting for. His prejudices were breaking down. His pride was being shattered by reality. I stood off to the side, observing in silence. I did not intervene. This was his lesson to learn. When the check-in was complete and the family walked away, I stepped forward. Langley did not look at me. His gaze was locked onto the desk, as if staring at the remnants of the world he had lost. I stood beside him, and then, in a quiet voice, I asked, "How does it feel?" He didn't answer. At first I thought he wouldn't say anything at all. But then, after a long silence, he whispered, "It's just a job." A lie. A desperate attempt to convince himself that this wasn't what it really was, a reckoning. I gave him a knowing look. "You denied me a room once," I reminded him. "Today, you served those you once scorned. How did that feel?" For the first time since I had returned to this hotel, Langley lifted his eyes to meet mine, and I saw it. Not just fear, not just regret. I saw the collapse of everything he had once believed. His entire worldview had shattered, and there was nothing left to hold on to. I didn't say another word. I simply nodded and walked away. His lesson had been taught, and the world he once knew would never return. Langley stood there, his hands resting on the desk as if for support, his shoulders slumped under the weight of his own realization. Everything he had once known about himself, his status, his authority, was gone. I could see it in his expression. He wasn't just looking at me, he was looking at his own downfall. "How does it feel?" I asked quietly. His lips parted, but no words came. His throat worked as if he wanted to respond, but the weight of the moment crushed any excuse he might have offered. Finally, in a voice barely above a whisper, he muttered, "It's just a job." A lie. A desperate attempt to convince himself that this wasn't what it really was, a reckoning. But I wasn't about to let him escape the truth so easily. "You once denied me a room," I reminded him. "Now you've been forced to serve those you once dismissed. Tell me, Langley, how did that feel?" He finally lifted his eyes to mine. What I saw in them wasn't just fear of me as his boss. It was the far more terrifying realization of his own insignificance. His power, his pride, everything he had built his self-worth upon, had collapsed. And there was no escape. I didn't need to say anything else. I simply nodded and walked away, leaving him to confront what he had become. But I knew that this was not the end, only a turning point. Everything was coming to a close. The employees who had once strutted through these halls with entitlement had already faced their own reckonings. Some had adapted, others had collapsed under the pressure of change. But this was never about revenge. It was a process of cleansing. They needed to experience what it felt like for their old world to disappear beneath them, to understand that the system they once controlled was now beyond their reach. Today was the final step. I had decided to gather them all, every person who had once judged me, dismissed me, turned their backs on me without a second thought. But now, the power dynamic had changed. They sat before me in the grand conference room, the same place where Langley had once led meetings with arrogance. Now their expressions were grim. They knew what was coming. They no longer held any control. Now everything depended on me. I let my eyes move over each of them, watching their nervous hands, the way some stared at the table, pretending to be composed. Others, those with nothing left to lose, met my gaze with quiet acceptance. Finally, I spoke. Today, you stand before a choice. A hush fell over the room, though no one had dared to speak in the first place. You have two options, I continued, my tone calm but firm. You may choose to leave. If you do, you will be given financial compensation, and you can walk away from this place forever. Some employees visibly relaxed, believing this was their escape, but I wasn't finished. Or, I added, you may stay, but if you choose to remain, understand that you will be working under an entirely new system. The rules have changed and you will follow them. You will not be granted the same privileges you once enjoyed. If you stay, you will have to prove your worth. Not through arrogance, but through work, through respect. You will work under the leadership of people you once ignored. For a long moment, no one moved. Then, I saw it. The breaking point. Some employees dropped their eyes, already shuffling the papers before them, mentally preparing to resign. They knew they couldn't survive in this new world. They had already decided to leave. Others, those who had been stripped of their pride but still held on to some hope, hesitated. They knew their options were limited. One hand rose. I turned my attention to the employee who had spoken, a former manager, one of the men who had once refused me service. His face was pale, his expression a mixture of fear and desperation. "And what happens if we leave?" he asked, his voice barely concealing the tremor in his words. I held his gaze. "You will start over," I said simply, "but without the privileges you once had. You will enter the world with nothing more than your own abilities to carry you forward. It will be your chance to rethink your life." His face darkened, because he knew. He knew that his old life had been built on a lie, and now that lie had been stripped away. The final days arrived. Some employees packed their belongings and left the hotel, unable to handle the changes, unwilling to face the reality of a world that no longer catered to them. Those who remained were beginning to adapt, slowly, reluctantly. They no longer walked through the halls with the same false confidence. They no longer saw themselves as superior. And for the first time, they understood the weight of their past actions. As I walked through the lobby on that last day, I saw Langley standing near the exit. His shoulders were slumped, his posture one of a man who had been utterly defeated. This was the same man who had once stood behind the reception desk with effortless confidence, deciding who was worthy of entry and who was not. Now he stood before me, knowing that everything had changed. I stopped beside him. He didn't look at me. His gaze was fixed on the floor, as if he wanted to disappear, to dissolve into the remnants of the world he had once ruled. "You didn't even try to know who I was," I said. He still didn't speak. I didn't need him to. His silence was enough. I watched as he finally nodded, a silent admission of everything he had lost. And then, without another word, he walked out the door. I didn't feel anger. I didn't feel triumph. It was simply the end of a story that had begun with humiliation, but ended with justice. Langley stood near the exit, his posture heavy with defeat. His shoulders slumped, his entire presence devoid of the arrogance he had once carried so effortlessly. This was the same man who had once refused me a room without hesitation, without question. He had dismissed me without even bothering to find out who I was. And now, here he stood, fully aware that everything had changed. I approached him, stopping just beside him. He didn't look at me. His gaze was fixed on the floor, as if searching for something, a sense of identity, a fragment of the confidence he had once possessed. But it was gone. "You didn't even try to know who I was," I said calmly. Still, he did not respond. His face remained eerily expressionless, but his eyes, they were empty. This was a man who had come face to face with the truth, that the world he had built for himself, the false foundation of superiority he had relied on for so long, had crumbled beneath him. He had nothing left, no position, no privilege, no power. Just the weight of realization. Finally, he gave a slow, almost imperceptible nod. But he still didn't raise his eyes. And then, without another word, he turned and walked out the door. I watched him leave, understanding that this was inevitable. There was nothing left to say. No need for anger. No reason for satisfaction. It was simply the end. An end to a story that had begun with humiliation, but concluded with justice. The The end top of form, bottom of form.